We have the third Old Testament character who we can say came close to filling the threefold office of Christ as prophet, priest, and king, was a man named Jehoiada. We'll read of him mainly in the second book of Chronicles, beginning in chapter 22, a man who came close to fulfilling the three offices of Christ. And we could say that the characteristic that stands out most in him is his confidence in God. So remember, Samuel tells us a Christ-like person is marked by his contact with God, that is in prayer. Zadok tells us a Christ-like person is marked by his having the character of God, being righteous. And now Jehoiada will show us that a Christ-like person is marked by his confidence in God. He trusts God. So we'll read 2 Chronicles chapter 22, beginning at verse 10. That is when Athaliah, that is a very wicked queen of Judah, Athaliah, the mother of Ahaziah, saw that her son was dead. She got up and destroyed all the royal family of the house of Judah, except that Jehoshabeath, the daughter of the king, took Joash, the son of Ahaziah, and stole him away from among the king's sons who were killed, and put him and his nurse in the bedchamber. So Jehoshabeath, the daughter of King Jehoram, the wife of Jehoiada the priest, she being the sister of Ahaziah, hid him from Athaliah so that she didn't kill him. He was hidden with them in the house of God for 6 years, and Athaliah reigned over the land. In the 7th year, Jehoiada strengthened himself and took the captains of hundreds, Azariah the son of Jeroham, and Ishmael the son of Jehohanan, and Azariah the son of Obed, and Messiah the son of Adaiah, Raphat the son of Zikri, into covenant with them. They went about in Judah and gathered the Levites out of all the cities of Judah, and the heads of fathers' houses of Israel, and they came to Jerusalem. All the assembly made a covenant with the king in the house of God. He said to them, "Behold, the king's son shall reign, as the Lord has spoken concerning the sons of David." And down to verse 11 of chapter 23. Then they brought out the king's son and put the crown on him and gave him the testimony and made him king. And Jehoiada and his sons anointed him, and they said, "Long live the king." When Athaliah heard the noise of the people running and praising the king, she came to the people in the house of the Lord. And she looked, and behold, the king stood by his pillar at the entrance, and the captains and the trumpeters by the king, and all the people of the land rejoiced, and blew trumpets, and singers also played on instruments of music, and led the singing of praise. Then Athaliah tore her clothes and said, "Treason, treason!" Jehoiada the priest brought out the captains of hundreds who were set over the army and said to them, "Get her out between the ranks, and whoever follows her, let him be put to death with the sword," because the priest said, "Don't kill her in the house of the Lord." So they made way for her, and she went to the entrance of the horse gate to the king's house, and they killed her there. Jehoiada made a covenant between himself and all the people and the king that they should be the Lord's people. In chapter 24, in first verse, Joash was 7 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 40 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Zilbiah of Beersheba. Joash did that which was right in the eyes of the Lord all the days of Jehoiada the priest. Now we've got one more passage to read, which is a rather sad passage, but our reason for reading it is that it makes mention of Zachariah, the son of Jehoiada, and that's important, this meditation. So chapter 24, still in verse 17, we read, "After the death of Jehoiada, the princes of Judah came and bowed down to the king. Then the king listened to them. They abandoned the house of the Lord, the God of their ancestors, and served the Asherim and the idols, and the wrath came on Judah and Jerusalem for this guiltiness of theirs. Yet he, that is God, sent prophets to them to bring them back to the Lord, and they testified against them, but they would not listen. And then notice this here, the Spirit of God came on Zechariah, the son of Jehoiada, the priest. And he stood above the people and said to them, "This is what God says. Why do you disobey the commands of the Lord? You can't succeed that way. Because you have abandoned the Lord, he has also abandoned you." They conspired against him and stoned him with stones at the command of the king in the court of the house of the Lord. So Joash the king didn't remember the kindness which Jehoiada his father had done to him, but killed his son. When he was dying, he said, "May the Lord look at it and deal with it." And again, may the Lord speak to us through these passages from his word. So Jehoiada is the third man that I find came close to filling the three offices of Christ as prophet, priest, and king, because he was a priest, but he put Joash on the throne at the age of 7. So while Joash was growing up and waiting to reach a maturity at which he'd be able to reign himself, there was need for somebody to reign for him. In countries that have kings and queens, if the king-to-be or queen-to-be is only a child when crowned, then they have somebody whom they call a regent who reigns in place of the king-to-be or queen-to-be until that king or queen-to-be arrives at an age of maturity. And it was Jehoiada who seems to have done that. So he was a priest, but he did the work of a king when he served as a regent while Joash was growing up, and his son became a prophet. So there he was coming close to filling those three offices. So that last and rather sad passage I read was to show us his son Zechariah, who became a prophet. Now, again, the name has a significance to us. The name Jehoiada means Jehovah knows. That's what we call God's omniscience, that he knows everything. And I find it impressive that Jehoiada named his son Zechariah, the son who became a prophet, because Jehoiada means Jehovah knows, and Zechariah means Jehovah remembers. So putting those two names together tells us Jehovah knows everything and he always will know everything. And because of this assurance that God knew everything, Jehoiada trusted God for the success of his undertakings for him, because he had confidence that since God had called him to do what he had to do, that God would make his will succeed, because God knew all about the problems and situations he had to face, but God knew also how to overcome them and how to make his will succeed. So God saw all the wickedness that was going on in Judah, and especially in the royal family, including the plotting to eliminate all the royal family. And he was confident that God would enable him and his helpers to deal with that situation. So this omniscience of God that is something we're reminded of in Psalm 139. I'll read you the first 4 verses of that psalm where we read, "Lord, thou hast searched me and thou hast known me. Thou knowest my sitting down and my getting up. Thou perceivest my thoughts from far away. Thou searchest out my path and my lying down, and art acquainted with all my ways. Indeed, there is not a word on my tongue, but behold, Lord, thou knowest it completely." Now, that truth is a warning to the wicked, that God knows everything, but it's a comfort to the faithful, that God knows everything, including all that we have to face and overcome, and that he knows how to deal with it. So, aware of God's omniscience gives confidence in God's protection. Jehoiada was assured that God knew of all the apparent risks that he had to take to put King Joash on the throne. He knew God knew all was involved, so he would protect Jehoiada himself and all his helpers, and he would cause it to succeed, that they'd get rid of Athaliah and put Joash on the throne. Athaliah was the mother of Ahaziah, who had been a king and who had just been assassinated as a judgment of God for his continuing to make worship of Baal the official religion of Judah. His father Jehoram had introduced Baal worship, but Ahaziah had continued it. And Athaliah then was a daughter of the wicked king Ahab and his wife Jezebel, and she had her parents' character, especially the character of her mother. Remember what Jezebel did? She threatened to eliminate Elijah, who was a prophet of God, and it was also she who ordered Naboth. Remember, King Ahab asked Naboth, "Could you sell me your vineyard?" Naboth said, "No, I won't, because God's law says that property must be kept in the family." Then Ahab home, intending us to pout about not being able to get Naboth's vineyard, but Jezebel said, "Well, aren't you the king? You should be able to get what you want. Leave it with me and I'll fix that up." And so she ordered that Naboth be falsely accused of blasphemy and that he be stoned, and that then Ahab would get his vineyard. Well, yes, that's the kind of woman that Jezebel was, and Athaliah was her daughter. So you know what to expect. It was like mother, like daughter in this case. Athaliah was a violent and self-centered person, and she tried to eliminate all the rest of the royal family to assure that nobody was left who might assassinate her and to rule in her place. And there were 3 kings who tried this tactic in the northern kingdom, the tactic of eliminating the entire royal family, lest anybody who was left might assassinate them. The 3 kings in the northern kingdom who tried that tactic were Baasha, Zimri, and Jehu. But there were only 2 monarchs in Judah who tried that tactic. And who were they? Well, Athaliah was one of them. And who was the other? Her husband, Jehoram, when he had been king. And he had assassinated all his brothers. Elijah the prophet had sent Jehoram a letter saying that you have assassinated your brothers who were better than you, but he had assassinated them. So that husband and wife, who each reigned in Judah, were the only monarchs Judah ever had who tried that tactic of eliminating the whole royal family. That's the kind of person then that Jehoiada had to deal with to put Joash on the throne. And Joash was Athaliah's grandson. So, but Jehoiada's wife, named Jehoshabeath, she was Athaliah's daughter also, or stepdaughter, but she didn't agree with what her mother wanted to do, so she hid baby Joash in the temple. And besides the fact that the temple was a sturdy building, because it was the same temple that Solomon had built, it was a sturdy building, but also it was God's house. So that was an assurance that it was not just a building that was protecting Joash, but it was God who was protecting him, because God wanted him to be put on the throne. And Jehoiada also realized that he had a part to fulfill in putting Joash on the throne. So he took action when Joash was 7 years old, 7 being the number of God and of infinity. So he had waited for God's time to take action, and then he enlisted military forces and told them of his plan. And he was taking a certain risk even in doing that, because he wouldn't have known for sure if all the military forces would have agreed with what he had wanted to do, or if some of them may have wanted to keep Athaliah as queen. But he informed them anyway of what he planned to do, because he knew it was God's will. He knew that God knew the hearts of all the military forces, so therefore God would know how to deal with them. However, I don't think it was very probable that any of the military forces would agree with Athaliah and take her side, because her husband Jehoram had been so unpopular. The closing verses about the life of Jehoram, chapter 21 and verse 20, tell us that when he died, he departed without being missed. Nobody missed him after he died. So he had not been a popular king, and Athaliah was his wife. But Jehoiada then told the military forces and the priests and the Levites of God's promise to keep David's lineage on the throne, and Joash now was the only survivor of that lineage. Now, we don't know just how much Jehoiada knew of how important that was to keep David's lineage on the throne, because Christ was to be born to the house and lineage of David. So Athaliah's attempt to eliminate the whole royal family was one of Satan's attempts on Christ, an attempt to keep him from being born by cutting off the lineage of David. But God prevented that from happening by laying it on the hearts of Jehoiada and his wife Jehoshabeath to hide Joash and then put him on the throne at the age of 7. That was one attempt of Satan to keep Christ from being born, but defeated. And of course, if Satan hypothetically had prevented Christ from being born, then he wouldn't have. But God just wouldn't let that happen. So Jehoiada then used a good strategy. He chapter 23 in verses 4 to 11, a long passage about how we had certain different people enter the temple at different hours, but it was a way of gradually filling the temple with military men and with priests who also were armed, and getting it filled gradually with a few people at a time coming in to avoid the suspicion that a large crowd entering the temple would have aroused. So he had good strategy because God knew how to work this plan out, because Jehovah knew everything, and Jehoiada had that confidence. And in our undertakings that God calls us to, we may not be threatened by any violent opposition, but there will certainly be some kind of opposition to anything that is of God, because Satan doesn't like God's will to succeed. So he'll instigate opposition. And it may be through people who aren't favorable toward the undertaking, or it might be by means of other happenings that opposition arrives. But yet we're assured that God knows everything about it, and he knows just how to make that undertaking succeed, because it's his will, and he has laid it on our hearts, and he'll safeguard it and cause it to succeed. So assurance of God's omniscience then gives us confidence in God's protection, and it also gives us confidence in God's provision. It seems to have been Joash's initiative to repair the temple, chapter 24, verses 4 and 5. We wanted to repair the temple if it hadn't been that Jehoiada had taught him faith in the true God, taught him about the true God, and taught him that that temple was the true God's house. And if, yes, we do read that Joash sort of gave Jehoiada a bit of a push to get after the priests and help them to get the temple repaired. But that might just have been a matter of the young who like to charge ahead and the older who are more reticent. At any rate, they got to the rebuilding of the temple. But the need for the temple to be repaired then was not just a matter of renovating it because of natural deterioration. Everybody who's ever owned a house or a building of any kind knows very well that there's always something that needs repairing or renovating because the forces of nature act on it. And so everything gradually deteriorates, and occasionally you have to renovate any building. But it was a lot more than that this temple needed, because it had not simply deteriorated by natural deterioration. We read in chapter 24 and verse 7 that the sons of Athaliah had vandalized the temple. So they had deliberately done damage to it in order to drive the people away from worshiping the true God and toward worshiping Baal and the other false gods associated with Baal. They had also stolen what had been given to the true God, whether in money or items that could be used in the worship at the temple. People had brought gifts for the true God, but the sons of Athaliah had stolen those items and taken away and used them for worship of Baal. In doing so, they were doing something similar to what Belshazzar, the Babylonian king, did. If they stole the temple dishes, for example, and used them in worshiping Baal, it would be like Belshazzar, who had a feast for the gods that the Babylonians believed in, and he used dishes that his ancestor Nebuchadnezzar had stolen from God's temple. So a lot of damage had been done to the temple, and it would have been a mammoth task to repair it. It was the same temple that Solomon had built, but when Solomon built it, he ruled over the United Kingdom, because the Jews hadn't yet divided into the two kingdoms of Israel and Judah. They were still one kingdom when Solomon was king. And it was at the height of its power and wealth at that time. Solomon received gifts from even visitors from all nations. And the temple had some very costly materials in it. But now Joash was ruling only the kingdom of Judah, because the division had taken place into the two kingdoms, and Israel, the northern kingdom, was much bigger than Judah, the southern kingdom. So, Judah was certainly a lot smaller than the United Kingdom had been when it had existed. So it would likely cost a horrendous amount of money and take a tremendous amount of work for such a small kingdom as Judah to rebuild God's temple. And it took faith then to expect that God would provide the funds necessary to cover all that cost and to provide the necessary manpower to do the job. But Joash and Jehoiada, I guess together, came up with the idea of making a chest, a sort of coin bank, to collect money for the repairs. They made a box and drilled a hole in the top of it, and then put it in the temple, and people came to the temple to worship God, would put money in it, knowing that that money was designated for the repair of the temple. And Joash also reminded the people of God's law given by Moses about a certain collection mentioned in chapter 24 and verse 9. What collection is it referred to here? Well, it would have been what they called the atonement offering. The instructions for it were given in Exodus chapter 30, verses 11 to 16, that said that every man 20 years old and over must each year pay half a shekel of silver that would go into that offering. And in type, it was seen as a ransom for his soul. It was a type of Christ as our Redeemer, who paid the ransom to save our souls. In fact, that's where we get the idea that the silver in the temple is a type of redemption, because it came from that offering of every man 20 years and over paying half a shekel each year. And that money was supposed to be used for the expenses in the tabernacle and then in the temple, and for the upkeep of those two buildings. In fact, that was the same tax that religious leaders in Christ's day came to Peter to ask for. They said, "Does your master pay that temple tax?" And Peter, who was usually pretty quick to open his mouth, he said, "Yes, he does." And then Christ showed him that, well, he wasn't really obliged to pay it, but he said, "Let's pay it so that they won't be offended." And he told Peter, "Go and catch a fish, and you'll find a coin in the fish's mouth that'll be just enough to pay the tax for you and me." It was that same tax. That was the tax that they were to pay. And they exercised faith that enough funds would be raised to pay the expenses of repairing the temple of the true God. And we read chapter 24 and verse 11 that the chest was filled and then emptied repeatedly. That is, when the chest was full, they'd empty it and put the money aside, then put it back empty in the temple and let the people fill it again. They did that repeatedly till it had been filled several times. And we read in verse 11 that they had an abundance of money when they got done. It's believable by that statement that there may have been people who gave more than they were obliged to give. Maybe men who gave more than that half shekel they had to give each year. At any rate, the Lord provided. And chapter 2 Kings chapter 12, where the same story is told with some of the details different, and verses 7 and 8 sound as though there might even be some priests who sacrificed offerings that they were entitled to, because when people brought certain kinds of offerings to the temple, a part of those certain offerings was income for the priests. But it sounds as though some of the priests might have actually taken some of that money that they were entitled to and given it to help pay the expenses of repairing the temple. So God laid on the people's hearts to give generously. And God also desired, or God honored the desire to repair the temple by providing capable workmen. And we read in chapter 24 and verse 13, and also in 2 Kings 12:15, that it wasn't even necessary to check up on those workmen who were repairing the temple. It wasn't necessary that anyone come around and ask them, "How are you doing?" and "Have you got this part almost done?" They didn't need any checking up on because they were trustworthy men. They could be counted on to do good work and without supervision. That was also part of God's faithfulness in providing, so they'd be able to rebuild or repair the temple. And because they had trustworthy men who would do good work, it was also assured that none of the money that was given would be lost or wasted. This is also a characteristic we find in Christ. Remember that when Christ fed the 5,000, we read that he fed them until they were all filled, so nobody went away from that feeding hungry. He gave them all it took to satisfy them. But after he had fed them all, he said, "Gather up the leftovers so that nothing will be wasted." Well, so it was a Christ-like feature that it was assured that none of the money given for the repair of the temple would be lost or wasted. That's how God responds to a Christ-like confidence in his provision. And just like Christ, who was rich in heaven, but who became poor for our sake, and who never used his divine power for his own benefit when he was on earth, he never ceased to be God, and he had the divine power at his disposition to serve others with it, but he never used his divine power for his own benefit. Instead, he trusted the Father's care of him and the promise that God the Father would give his angels charge over him to keep him in all his ways and bear him up lest he dash his foot against a stone. Yes, he trusted in the Father's care when he was on earth. So Jehoiada is a picture of Christ-likeness that trusts in God's protection and his provision. But assurance of God's omniscience gives confidence not only in God's protection, not only in God's provision, but also in God's peacemaking. And even though soldiers and armed Levites surrounded Joash to protect him in the temple, yet the result of all this undertaking was peace in the land. And Jehoiada gave an order not to execute Athaliah in the temple, chapter 23 and verses 14 and 15. Why didn't Jehoiada want the military men to put Athaliah to death in the temple? Because they had her there. She came into the temple, and that's where she shouted treason. But God told them, or I'm sure Jehoiada told them, not to put her to death in the temple for the same reason that God had not allowed David to build the temple, because he was a man of war. He had had Solomon build it because he was a man of peace. Evidently, God didn't want war in any form or any form of violence to be associated with his house. And in fact, world peace will only come when Christ, the Prince of Peace, comes, but he will be the Prince of Peace, and he doesn't want any form of violence associated with his house. When God had just brought Israel out of Egypt, he gave them instructions that when they wanted to offer sacrifices before they had the tabernacle built, therefore didn't have any altars built, he told them, if you build an altar during this part of your journey, then he said, you shall make an altar of earth for me, and shall sacrifice your burnt offering and your peace offerings, your sheep and your oxen on it. Or if you make me an altar of stone, you shall not build it with hewn stones, for if you lift up your tool on it, you have polluted it. Why didn't God want his people to make him an altar of stone that had been carved with a tool to offer sacrifices in the desert? Why did it have to be of unhewed stones? Usually just yeah, I had trouble getting rid of an advertisement on my screen there. Okay. Why didn't God want Israel to build him an altar of hewn stone? And he said, if you lift up your tool on it, you've polluted it. Well, that word is used many times, the word translated tool there. It's used many times in the Old Testament, but that's the only time it's ever translated tool. That same word is translated knife 5 times, and it's translated dagger 3 times, but it's translated sword 349 times, and only once tool. So as you can see, it was a word that was usually associated with violence, and God didn't want an altar to be built for him with an instrument that was usually used for violence. Same idea again. God wanted his temple to be associated with peace. The last temple of which the construction is mentioned in the Old Testament was the one that the Jews built after their return from the Babylonian captivity. And God promised to bless it when he said, in this place I will give peace, says the Lord of armies. There was no strife or rebellion or a friction, enmity of any kind for any reason until Satan rebelled against God. That was the first introduction of any kind of strife or fighting or violence. And in the final state, in the new creation, where there will be no sin in any form, there will be eternal peace. And God's instructions to New Testament saints say, blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called children of God. Matthew 5:9. And if it is possible, to the extent that it depends on you, be at peace with everybody, Romans 12:18. Or be eager to keep the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace, Ephesians 4, verse 3. And one more reference, follow after peace with everyone and holiness, without which nobody will see the Lord, Hebrews 12:14. Yes, Christ is called the Prince of Peace, and when he reigns, there will be worldwide peace, but not before. Now, human reasoning might have said to Jehoiada that it was foolish to let Athaliah get outside the temple before executing her. Human reasoning would have said, look, this one woman is very tricky, crafty, and there might be people just outside there who are in favor of her. Wouldn't it be wiser to catch her while she's catchable inside the temple and execute her there? But Jehoiada said, no, we're not going to perform an execution in the house of the Lord. And Jehoiada had the boldness to take that stand because he believed that God knew all about the problems that appeared, and that the Lord knew exactly where Athaliah was, and that he would enable them to put her to death, but outside the house of the Lord. Jehoiada trusted that God honored those who honored him, as we read in 1 Samuel 2 and verse 30, by not letting Athaliah get away when they got her outside the temple. And God insists on an atmosphere of peace and stillness and quietness when we gather around him, to be impressed with his greatness and his holiness, as indicated in Psalm 46 and verse 10, be still and know that I am God. And Habakkuk 2:20, the Lord is in his holy temple, let the earth be silent before him. And yet another, Psalm 99 verse 5, exalt the Lord our God, worship at his footstool, he is holy. Can't you just sense the atmosphere of peace and quietness, stillness, wanting to take in an atmosphere of awe and wonder about the greatness and majesty of God? Jehoiada seems to have understood that that was what God wanted, so he wouldn't allow that Athaliah be put to death in the house of the Lord, because he had confidence in God's peacemaking. Well, Jehoiada then came close to filling the threefold office of Christ, because he was a priest, and while Joash was had been made king but was growing up from the age of 7 until maturity, Jehoiada served as a regent, therefore he was doing the work of a king, and his son became a prophet. And the name Jehoiada means Jehovah knows, which is what we call God's omniscience. And because he was assured of God's omniscience, therefore he was assured that God knew everything about all the that it would take to repair the temple. God knew of all the apparent dangers that there would be in putting away Athaliah. God knew of what sacrifices it would take and of the difficulty of getting enough manpower to rebuild the temple. He had confidence that God knew all that and could take care of it. And God saw all the wickedness that had been going on in Judah, and especially in the royal family, including Athaliah's plotting to eliminate the royal family. But Jehoiada had confidence that God would enable him and his helpers to get the temple repaired and to get Joash made king. Trust or confidence in God is a Christ-like characteristic, because Christ, who never used his divine power for his own benefit when he was on earth, but trusted in the Father's care because he was doing the Father's will, he showed that he himself lived by faith. And assurance of God's omniscience gives confidence in God's protection, and confidence in God's provision, and confidence in God's peacemaking. If we are to reflect Christ's life in us, and if we are to resemble him to the extent that it's possible to resemble him in this present life, let us seek to live with such complete confidence in God and in his ways that even though his ways are higher than ours, we know they're perfect. And let us remember that he who trusts in him will not be disappointed. Our blessed Lord God, what a wonder it is that thou carest for us, and thou knowest every detail of our lives, and whatever thou callest us to do, thou givest us the assurance that thou wilt cause it to succeed, because thou knowest all the problems involved and all that's happening, and thou wilt assure that what is thy will succeed, because thou art both omniscient and omnipotent. So we would live by faith also in thy perfection, in thy capability of causing thy will to succeed. We would reflect Christ living in us by this confidence in thee. And we pray for the grace to do so in the name of thy beloved Son,